Everybody can hear?
Yes, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Okay, so I want to finish off the big topic that we were on, which was Eid Echad Misayea. So again, there's one more part that I wanted to do, and then next week we'll start, hopefully, the topic of Moda B'Miktsas, also a very massive and very intricate topic. So what we're discussing is the following idea, and that is that what we know, what is agreed upon, by consensus, is that even though you need two witnesses in Jewish law in order to, win a case that involves, some sort of financial issue, dine mominis, in other words, requires two witnesses. And certainly any capital case, dine nefashos, or knossos, penalties, all these require two witnesses. However, that's the gold standard of evidence. However, one witness is also sufficient to impose a shvua, an oath, on the other party. That's called eid echad mechayev shvua, a single witness. Again, it's just to make it clear, as the Rambam explains very explicitly in the fifth chapter of Hilchos Edus, the laws of testimony, the eid echad that we're talking about is an eid echad who is a kosher aid in every way, meaning he is worthy to join with someone else to be, to establish this gold standard that we're talking about. If he, were to combine with someone else, meaning he's not a relative, he, has a sterling reputation, he's not what we call a nogea b'davar, means somebody who is compromised in terms of his objectivity because he has an interest in the case. So we're talking about really the status of a single witness, one who is worthy of joining with another to become, a part of, classic testimony, but there's only one of them. So what's agreed upon by everyone is that such an individual has the ability to impose an oath, a shvua daraisa, as we call it, on the party that he, testifies against. What's not clear, and where you have immense controversy surrounding our Gemaras and Bava Metzia especially, is whether or not Eid Echad Misayea is also poter min hashvua. I mean, if you have an Eid Echad on your side, not opposite you, but on your side, meaning advocating or supporting your position, and let's say you have an oath, that you're obligated to take in this case. So will a single aid, will he exempt you from your oath? Just to make it clear, if you had two witnesses on your side and the other side did not, you would win every case, whether or not you were claiming or you were defending. It wouldn't make a difference. And if there was a obligation for you to take a shvua, let's say moda b'miktsas or something like that, but instead you could bring two witnesses who would attest to the fact that you are really, not liable, you would never have to take an oath if you were supported by two witnesses. Even if it were a situation where, likely it would seem that you have to pay money, like there's something, called eni odea im praticha. Let's say if somebody says, you owe me money. So there are two cases in the Mishnah at the end of Bava Kama. Somebody says, you owe me $100. And the other guy responds, he says, I don't know. But there are two different ways of saying, I don't know. We talked about this last week a little bit. One way of saying, I don't know is saying, I know for sure that I borrowed money from you. Meaning at what point I owed you. But I'm not sure whether I repaid you or not. I can't remember, or for whatever reason, I can't be certain that I repaid you, although I admit that at one point I owed you money. That's called Eini Yodea Im Praticha. I don't know whether or not I paid you back. And normally, all things being equal, if that's the best I can do, I mean, I don't have any evidence one way or another. I'm just saying, Eini Yodea Im Praticha, you're chayiv, you're obligated, because the cheskas chiyuv, meaning the default is, I admit that I used to owe you money, and I just don't know what happened since. So The status quo ante is that I was obligated. I don't know that I'm not obligated, and therefore my position is weak enough that I would have to pay. However, if it was just to make the other side, if it was not eni odea praticha, but eni odea im hischayavti, that's the second case in the Mishnah in the end of Bava Kama. He says, not that I'm not sure that I ever owed you money, right? I remember we discussed it. I don't remember when I took out whether or not in the end I took out the loan or I didn't take out the loan. I don't remember whether I paid you back, but I don't remember whether I borrowed from you. So then the rule is the cheskas chiyuv, until we know for sure that he admits that he owed at one point or another, then that's, it's not kofra kol because he's not denying it, but he's not admitting it either. So that's called eni odea im his chayavti, and he's patur. Let's say you had an eni odeum praticha case, meaning somebody said you owe me $100, and the guy said, I do remember borrowing from you. I don't remember whether I paid you back or not. Or I did some transaction. I'm not sure if it was, a legal repayment or not. Whatever. There's some doubt about the payment. So he would be chayiv. Let's say all of a sudden, then, before he pays, two witnesses show up in court, and they establish that he is not obligated, right? Otherwise, he would be paying. But as long as he has two witnesses on his side, right, and the other fellow does not, then that's a clear win. So the point is that when it comes to two witnesses always win every case. If they're not contradicted, they win every case, whether they are on the side of the defense or the side of the claimant. However, what we're not sure about is a echad misayea, if you have a single witness. So if you let him loose and he is accusing someone else of, chicanery or obligation or whatever it is, he definitely creates an obligation to take a shvua. But does he exempt an obligation to take a shvua for the person who he is supporting? That is the big debate. That's the big debate. So we've been discussing that for the last couple of weeks. And it's a very massive topic, and it really goes to the heart and core of a really important question, and that is, how close is Eid Echad, is a single witness, to two witnesses, right? Obviously they're part of like a larger category of Eidos, but one of the unique features of the gold standard of Eidos is that nothing can beat it as long as we don't have evidence that there's any corruption. The most you can ever get is a deadlock, as we've discussed, trey or trey, or that's the principle, trey kamea. Even if you have 100 witnesses that contradict two witnesses, as long as it's not what we call hazama, they're not saying, you're a liar, you couldn't possibly be witnesses, you were with us somewhere else. That's called hazama, that we believe the edim ha-zomimim, hamazimim, sorry. But if it's what we call hakasha, which means a contradictory testimony, so it's always trey utrey, and really it's trey kamea. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's 2 against 2 or 2 against a million, right? With testimony is testimony, evidence and witnesses are witnesses, and you can't do more than that. Now, an Eid Echad is not the gold standard, right? So if you have 2 against 1, you're going to go with the 2. So the question is, though, with regard to everything else, is there a parallel between 2 for Mammon and 1 for Shua? Or since there is already a drop-off, maybe the qualitative drop-off applies even with regard to Shua. So just because you can exempt someone if you have 2 witnesses supporting him doesn't mean that even with regard to only a Shavua that you can exempt someone if he has an Eid Echad on his side. So that is the massive argument about that particular issue. Today, I want to finish up the discussion, at least part that we'll have, because this is a massive topic. There's much more, by discussing whether or not it makes sense to distinguish between the different Shvuos D'Oraisa, the different biblical oaths. So last week we did discuss the argument between the Shach and the Ksos HaChoshen, really the Rosh, the Kshach, against the Ksos HaChoshen. Remember, there are three biblical shvuos. One is Eid Echad, right? The other is Moda b'miksas. Moda b'miksas means that he admits part of the charge against him. And the third one is Shvuas HaShomrim, meaning a person was, had agreed, to take custody of and to watch and take responsibility over someone else's object. He's a shomer, that's what it's called. And then something happens to the object, right? So something happens to the object and he can't return it. So he is obligated, he owes the other fellow an explanation with a shvua, with an oath. That's called a chiyuv shvua, shvuas hashomrim. So what we saw last week is that the Ksos HaChoshen takes the position. He says, you know what? Can a single witness exempt a person from a biblical oath? Says the Ksos HaChoshen. In my opinion, it depends which oath. If the oath that we're talking about is Shvuas HaShomrim, he says, then the answer is no. If the oath that we're talking about is Moda b'miktsas or Eid Echad, the answer is yes. Why? So again, the truth is one could have made the same argument in the exact opposite way. I'll explain why in a minute. But the Ksos HaChoshen's thinking goes back to the principle I had mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and that is that Eini Odea im Praticha, if I know that I at some point was obligated, I had an obligation to you, but I'm not sure whether I discharged it or not, that is chayiv, because the cheskas chiyuv, what I know, the last thing I know is that I owed you, and I don't know that ever stopped, and therefore the default is that I still owe you. So what the Ksos HaChoshen says is that Shvuas HaShomrim, which is B'tainas Shema, it's the only one of the three biblical Shavuos which doesn't need, a certain claim against it. Like if I come to you and I say, I think you owe me $100, and you say, I know I owe you 50, but I don't owe you 100. That's not motive b'miktas. Why? Because it doesn't have a tinus vadai. The person who's accusing or the person who is claiming, for him to impose a shvuas motive b'miktas, he has to have a tinus vadai. The same is true with regard to Eid Echad, if an Eid Echad were come to court, let's say, and he were to say, I'm not sure whether or not I have a suspicion that maybe you owe money to your friend, so the friend would not, the other party would not be obligated to take a shua because, it's all very murky unless the claim is being made in an assertive, definitive way, right? So I don't have to respond to that claim. It's not a sufficiently compelling, convincing claim that I would be chayiv to take a shvua. There's one exception amongst the shvuas haraisa of the three, and that's shvuas hashomrim. Because what is shvuas hashomrim? Shvuas hashomrim, as I said before, is I have you watching my object, right? And then something happens to the object, and let's say you're a shomer, what we call a shomer sachar, right? So you're getting paid to watch this object. If it gets stolen and you're getting paid to watch it, you're liable. But let's say an accident happens that you couldn't prevent. Like let's say it gets hit by lightning and it gets destroyed. So that's called a patur onus. If you're a shomer sacher, you're patur mi ones. So this is what happens. Ruvain says to Shimon, I gave you my object to watch. I said I would come and collect it in 30 days. The 30 days are up. I'd like my object back. Thank you so much. Right? Now, Shimon responds to Ruvain, oh, so sorry, but there was an earthquake yesterday, and your precious object got destroyed in the earthquake. Right? Now, Ruvain, the owner, he can't call Shimon a liar. He can't accuse him of anything. He just says, listen, I want my object back or I want an explanation. But he doesn't know what happened to it because he wasn't on the premises when the earthquake hit. He doesn't know if the earthquake destroyed his property or not. So that's called Tainus Shema. Tainus Shema means that the claim can even be, one that isn't definitive. It could be a, plausible or possible chiyuv, right? A suffix. So Shvuas HaShomrim is chayv mishum suffix, because remember that there's no way, all things being equal structurally, unless coincidentally it's otherwise, but structurally, I live in my property and the owner lives in his property. So if an accident takes place, right, during, the stay of this object in my property, how would the owner know about it? And that's not the same as motive mixas or eid echad, where if somebody's making a charge against me, he better be definitive about it. So anyway,
The difference
so
between a shomer that's getting paid and one that's doing it for free?
yes, the difference is not in the question of Tainus Shema, but in the
Difference
following.
is in liability, right?
Yeah, the level of liability. A shomer chinam who does you a favor and he's watching the object for free, he's not liable even for theft. He's only liable for negligence, what we call pshia. In other words, if he was negligent and the object got destroyed, then he would be obligated to pay, because even though he's doing the shmira for free, it's still shmira. He's still, committed. The other fellow is relying on him, right, to make sure that minimum, liability or minimum shmira, is going to take quality shmira takes place. So shomer chinim is obligated b'pshia. Shomer sachar, because he's being paid, so there should be what we call a shmira me'ula. There should be a higher level. He should have an alarm system. He should have more formidable walls, or guards or whatever it is. He's being paid. It's a business, so he should give better protection. He should have, he has more benefits. He should have more liability. A socher, by the way, a renter, that's a debate in the Gemara, whether he's like a shomer chinam or he's like a shomer sachar. But we paskin that he has the same level of liability as a shomer sachar. It's almost like by renting, but being able to use that, they kind of like, that constitutes almost like a shomer sachar. And a shoel, a borrower, he has the full liability because he's as the Gemara says, kol hana shalo, meaning he's getting to borrow this object he's borrowing my what is it, lawnmower, right? And he's allowed to use it, and he's not paying for it. So if something happens to it, at least let him be liable. You know, he's an insurance company for me or something like that. The only thing that a shoel is pater on, this is fascinating, is what we call mesamach mas malacha, because he borrowed the object in order to use it. So if the object dies a natural death during use, then he shouldn't have to pay for that. So, for example, he bought the lawnmower. Okay, so let's say the lawnmower dies during use, meaning it's a lawnmower on its last legs, let's say, or there's something wrong with the machine or whatever it is. So when he uses it, it dies. In that circumstance, he'd be exempt. But if like he was hit by lightning, he'd be obligated because since he's getting free usage, kol hana shalo, it's like, as I say, there's a balance between the benefits and the liability. The greater the benefits, the greater the liability. Like as I say, it makes sense, right? There's a correlation between benefit and liability. So the shomer chinam,
high risk, high reward.
Yeah, high risk, high reward, exactly. So the shomer chinam is the opposite, no reward, and therefore very little liability, only negligence. The shoel has high benefits, higher, so therefore, he has high reward. Therefore he has high risk. He has a higher liability. Anyway, the point is that either way, though, the by the way, in this week's parsha, this idea of Shvuas HaShomrim and the four Shomrim, especially three of the four, Shomer Chinam, Shomer Sachar, and Shoel, are all mentioned in this upcoming parsha of Mishpatim. And it's very interesting, by the way, that again, I don't want to get too far field on this, but if you look at the psukim in Mishpatim, they talk about Shomer Chinam and Shomer Sachar as Shomrim, as watchmen, as people who are custodians of the object. But when it comes to Shoel, the Torah just says V'chiyishal when he borrows. It doesn't call him a shomer shoel. And we don't call a shoel a shomer shoel. We just call him a shoel because kol ana shalo. He is just, he has huge benefits. And therefore his liability, is equally expansive. But anyways, the four shomrim, whatever happens to the object that they are exempt for, even the shoel, as I say, is exempt from mesa machmas. He borrows a cow, he's allowed to use the cow. But if the cow dies, if the cow dies as an accident, then he's liable. But if the cow dies during and because of the normal malacha that he borrowed it for, then he shouldn't be liable for that because that was part of the deal that he gets to use the object. The reason he has high liability is because he gets to use it. But if when using it, it dies because of its own inadequacy, then that it's not fair, that he should be charged for that. He got a lemon, right? So anyway, but either way, the point is that whatever happens to this object that needs clarification when he can't give it back, it happens on the watch and in the place of the shomer. And therefore, it's not like, the owner should know whether there's an obligation or not. And therefore, if he's wishy-washy about it, he says, oh, maybe you owe me money, so then we dismiss it. No, in the case of shomer, he can't know. And therefore, it's natural that the chiyuv shvua would be al safek. But here there's an interesting argument, and here's where I can go in two opposite ways. So the way that some Rishonim, the Ravid and the Ramban and most of the Balitosis, the way they understand is they say, listen, Shvuas HaShomim is a lesser obligation than Moed B'Miktsas and Eid Echad, because Moed B'Miktsas and Eid Echad, there's a Tainus Vadai, and here it's a Tainus Sav. Here he's speculating. So it's, you're obligated to take a Shua, but it's less of a formidable obligation because it's not accompanied by a definitive claim. So we need to clarify. You need to be what we call, be mefayes. You want to put, the concerns or the anxiety of the owner to rest. But it's not really, it's not as serious an obligation as if somebody says, I know for a fact you owe me $100, or the Eid Echad says, I know for a fact you owe him $100. Here, the claimant doesn't know, and therefore the shavua is a lesser obligation, and that's how they look at it. However, the Rambam and the Rimigash, I'll explain the example of what the issue is in just a second. They clearly go exactly the opposite way. They say, you know why? You know why it is that Shvuas HaShomrim is besafek? Not because it's a weaker Shvua, but because on some level it's a stronger Shvua. What do you mean it's a stronger Shvua? So what they say, the Rebbe Gash says the best. He says because really the Chiyuv Shvua was a possibility the second that the deposit took place. When I give you my object and I say I'm going to come back for it in 45 days, right? What I'm saying is in 45 days, you have to either give me back the object or you have to clarify why you're not giving me back the object. So in a way, it's not that, in day number 45, when I don't get my object back, all of a sudden there's a taina suffix, maybe something happened that you're liable for. No, the shvua was impending and predictable. For if you weren't going to pay me, or you weren't going to produce the object and admit that you owe it to me, it's almost like that shvua is part of the fabric of the initial obligation, right? It's part of what we call the chiyuv hashava. What are they trying to explain? The following really interesting issue. We normally have a rule, and that is that a tainus katan lo shma taina. The Gemara says in Masachet Shavuos, and Mem Beis and Beis, that if a minor claims, let's say moed b'miktsas, right? So the minor says, you owe me or you owe my father $100. And the other guy says, no, I only owe 50. So a tainus katan lo shma taina, because he's a minor. He doesn't have, we don't trust his knowledge, or he doesn't formally have the ability to bring, somebody to an oath in that way. Tainus katan lo shma taina. So the question is this: what about Shavuos HaShomrim, which is besafek? Can a katan who is a mafkid, or the mafkid died and now the katan is standing in his stead, can he demand a Shavuos HaShomrim? So the Ravid in Perek Beis Hilchos Skiros Halacha Zayin says, "Are you crazy? It doesn't make any sense. If a katan cannot demand a shvua vadai, like he's saying, I know for sure, in his squeaky voice, because he's only a minor, he says, I know for sure that, you owe my father or you owe me like $100. We ignore it. So when he comes to court and he says, maybe you owe me $100, all of a sudden we're going to take it seriously? That's a Raven's line. He says, al vadai shalo ein nishbaim al safek shalo kol shekain. I mean, if we don't honor his, absolute, claim, right, out of conviction, then certainly we're not going to take seriously when it's compromised even more. He's a katan and it's a taina safek. There's nothing to talk about. That's what the Ravid says. But this Ravid is a critique of the Rambam. The Rambam in Perek Beis, Hilchos Schiros Halacha Zayin, says even though typically ein nishbaim al tainas katan, the katan's taina is ignored. However, says the Rambam, when it comes to Shavuos HaShomrim, which is al safek, then we take it seriously. So that's what the Ravid says. What? It makes no sense. You should take it even less seriously. So what's the answer? So this is where the Rimigash in Masechet Shavuos says it even more strongly on the Rambam. The Rambam is just following his lead, and he says basically this is the idea. He says really the reason that the Taina Safek works in Shavuos HaShomrim is because it isn't the Taina Safek that triggers the Shvua. It's the fact that you aren't returning the object. You have a Chiyav Hashava when you get the object. At that moment, when you receive the object, at that moment you have an obligation either to return it in 30 days or whatever the amount you agreed, or to clarify what happened to it. So the obligation to clarify is not a doubt, that begins on day 30 or day 45 when you can't receive. All of a sudden, oh, you can't give me back the object? True, I don't know what happened, but maybe something happened that makes you liable. That's the way the Ravid looks at Shavuos Hashem. But the way that the Rambam and the Rimigash looked at Shavuos Hashem, that's not what happened. What happened was on day one, when he received the object, the unstated but implicit condition was in 30 days or in 45 days or in 100 days, whatever the amount, doesn't make a difference. In whenever the object is due to be, returned to its owner, it either has to be returned or you have to clarify with a shvua why you're not returning it. So then it's really the shvua bitam safek is really 1 second is really a vadai part of the Chiyav Hashava. Well, don't give me 1 more second. And therefore, says the Rimigash and the Ravid, what difference does it make whether the owner is a katan or a gadol? You're not really responding to the taina safek. So you could say, like the Ravid says, oh, it's taina safek, 2 strikes. There's a taina safek and he's a katan. Just ignore it. He said, no, not 2 strikes. It's part of the Chiyav Hashava. It doesn't matter who the owner is. You're not allowed to steal from a katan. And if you take an object and you have to return it to a katan, you have to return it to the katan. It's part of the obligation to return. You return the object, or if you can't return it, you clarify what happened to it. And therefore, says the Rambam and the Rimigash, even though ein nishbaim al tainas katan, when there's a chiyuv shvua al yedei safek, that actually is a strength. Now, if that's the case, so that's where the Ksos HaChoshen, and I'll take your question in 1 more second. So the Ksos HaChoshen says, that's why I think that even if it's true that Eid Echad Misayeya, that a support of Eid Echad can exempt the Shvua, he can exempt the regular Shvua, but exempting the Shavuos HaShomrim is actually more difficult because that is actually a more forceful obligation. It's part of the Chiyav Hashava. It's Eniodea impraticha. So if you want to say that Eidachon Messiah exempts, what you're really saying is that Eidachon Messiah can be poter mamon or a chiyuv hashava. The shvua is just a way of fulfilling your obligation to clarify why it is you're not returning the object. You have to either return the object or explain why you're not returning the object. And therefore, Eidachad Messiah would be overstepping his bounds, and therefore he is not effective in exempting in this particular case. That's so the Ksasa Choshen ends up saying it's not, sadna da'ara chad, meaning the lay of the land is not, the same for all three shvuos doraisa. There's a good case to be made that, there's a difference between shvuos hashomer and the others. By the way, the Ravid would agree too, just that he thinks the difference would go in the other direction. Namely, that the obligation of shvua and shomrim is a weaker obligation because it's only a safek. Whereas for the Rambam and the Rimigash, the obligation is stronger because the fact that a suffix is enough is an indication that it's not about the claim, it's about the obligation to return or to clarify. And therefore, according to the Ksos, he doesn't quote the Rambam and the Rimigash, I have to say. He has other evidence that he invokes, but it's the same idea. And the idea is that Eidachad Messiah will work for Moed B'Miktas and Eidachad, but it will not work for Shavuos Hashem. I'm sorry, there was a question? Go ahead.
Yes. In the case of Shomer, does it make a difference if the owner of the object solicited the Shomer or if the Shomer solicited the owner to guard the object?
Not really.
And is there also a contractual agreement sometimes invoked, a written one, of sub-documentation, a shtar of some sort?
Right. Well, shtar is important in certain things, like in a milva and other things like that. In shmira, not so much. In shmira, your questions are good questions in the sense that, in theory, you could have made distinctions like that, like what you're suggesting. In fact, the most important thing in the configuration of Dinei Shomrim is the level of reward versus liability, not who initiates and whether or not it's oral or contractual. Meaning, what you're saying is reasonable. It makes sense that you might draw the line in those places, but as far as I'm aware, in fact, that's not a distinction that the halakha makes. The halakha makes a distinction instead in terms of the level of reward and the level of liability, meaning shomer chino, shomer sachar, socher, shoel. There are some interesting other cases like that. Again, I don't want to get too deeply involved, but that's one thing very quickly. The Mishnah in the seventh parak of Bab Metzia and Asocher, has a fascinating discussion. Masne shomerchinam lios keshoel, masne shoel lios keshomerchinam. Let's say that the even though there are these four categories, right, and they make a lot of sense because of the proportion, as we said, of benefit and liability. But let's say the agreement between the two parties was to alter, the equation a little bit. So let's say he said, I want to be a shomer sachar, but I want my liability to be like shomer chinam, and the guy agrees, or vice versa, or something like that. So if this is done through a kinyan sudar, it's under what the Gemara calls the rubric of what's called masna mashakasa b'torah, b'tnai davar shebemamon. Meaning you're not allowed to change the halacha. You're not in charge of the halacha. The Rabboni Shalom is in charge of the halacha. So normally we say masna masha kosa b'torah. If a person tries to make conditions to alter the law, tanai batel or ma'isakayim, it's futile. However, when it comes to dine mamanis, when it comes to monetary matters, so the halacha is more flexible. So here you have a debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, no, if it's monetary matters, then Tanai Davar Sheba Mamon, Adam Masna Masha Kasa B'Torah. Then as long as both parties agree, since it's about, their money and it's consensual, then they can, to some extent, they can rewrite, the halakhic playbook. So that's interesting, what would happen in cases like that. But either way, like when it's Masa Masha Kosa B'Torah, let's, for example, what impact does that have on the Shvua Doraisa? Because a Shvua is, on the one hand, it stems from the, monetary legal relationship between the parties. On the other hand, you're taking the Sefer Torah and the Bezdin, we don't really think of that as, as mominus. It's applied to dine mominus, to monetary cases, but it's, you're kind of at that point crossing over, into a very spiritual, realm. So it's an interesting issue, and it's a very, rich discussion, in the post. Okay, so that's number one. So now let's move on. Having said that, so now I want to explore another possible distinction. Once we open the door to making distinctions within the realm of Shvuos Doraisa, of biblical oaths, so there might be other distinctions to make, both in terms of the hierarchy and other things. So I want to zero in on another famous argument regarding the possibility of distinguishing between the three Shvuos Doraisa, and for a very different reason, and one which opens up a whole other line of thinking or of analysis related to what we've been discussing. But okay, and that is as follows. So I want to just start by reading it. I'm going to read the short version first because I don't want to go beyond today, and you can get the most of it from the short version. The longer version, we have two Marmakomos in front of you, I hope. One is a little older one that's like 4 pages, and then there's another one that's like 7 or 8 pages or 9 pages, and that's the newer one that we gave out last week. So let's start with the older set first, and look on page one second, page 2.
Is it the next to the most recent one that we're talking about?
Yeah, not the most recent, but the one before, which
Okay.
is 4 pages. And I want page 2, where it says Nemuke Yosef, Masechet Bava Metzia, Daf Aleph Amud Aleph. Everybody have that?
Yes. Masechet Bava Metzia, Daf Aleph Amud Aleph.
The
Yeah,
Nemuke Yosef.
got it.
Okay, the second one on the page. So this is, I'll tell you what he says first, and then I'll read it in so you'll appreciate it more, hopefully. And that is as follows. The Nemuke Yosef is really quoting the Ran. This is really the Chiddush of Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona, or Gerona, whatever proper pronunciation is. Rabbeinu Nisim, the Ran, was, again, one of the famous Spanish scholars from the school of the Ramban. So the Ran, quoted by the Nebuch Yosef, said the following. He says, listen, even if it's true generally that Eid Echad Messiah, that a supportive aid does not exempt from a shua, from an oath, it actually will exempt from a shvuas Eid Echad. Meaning, if Eid Echad, if Ruvain the Eid Echad, make sure you understand what I'm saying here. If one Eid Echad named Ruvain comes to court and testifies, against Avraham, okay? Ruvain testifies against Avraham, and he wants Avraham to take a shua, right? And then Shimon comes to court. He's also an Eid Echad, but he supports Avraham. So you have warring Eid Echads on each side of the case, right? The first one, Ruvain, if he came alone, then Avram would have to take a shvua, right? But now that Shimon, counters him, so that seems to be the problem of Eid Echad B'Sayea, whether or not he's potem and a shvua or not, right? Can a single witness We know he can impose a shvuah, an oath. Can he also exempt from an oath? That's the issue we've been discussing. So what the Ran says is, even if, for example, an Eid Echad could not be poter, Eid Echad Messiah cannot be poter for motive b'mikzas or shvuas hashomrim, because really an Eid Echad does not have the power to exempt. That's when we're talking about motive b'mikzas and shvuas hashomrim. But when it comes to Eid Echad, for a totally different reason, there would be no shvuah. What's a totally different reason? As long as they came, somewhat in tandem, but we'll explain what that means in a moment. So then they just knock each other out. They negate each other. They neutralize each other. In other words, it's what the Nebuchadnezzar Yosef / Ran is saying is, in principle, Eid Echad b'Sayeya, a supportive Eid Echad does not exempt from a shvuah. However, when he's coming to neutralize another Eid Echad, he does, not because he exempts from the shvuah, but because he ends up neutralizing the source of the shvuah. Namely, he contradicts the other Eid Echad, and we just treat them both, I'll say these words, kiman delesa. When they contradict each other, we throw them both out of court. Instead of saying, well, now we have two Eid Echads, they're both in court, they're equally balanced, but we accept this Kabbalah Sedus will say of each. They're Kaman Isa. So that's a fascinating issue, right? Namely, now this is a question to ask about one aid against another aid or about two aidim against two aidim, right? Namely, when you have hakchasha, when you have equally balanced positions, right? In the case of 2 against 2, it'd also be 2 against 100 or 100 against 2. It doesn't make a difference. As we said, Trey is kameya. But when you have this situation of hakchasha of an Eid Echad or hakchasha of Shnai Meidim, do we say that it's ki'isa or kilesa? Do we say that both are standing, even though they're fighting to a draw somewhat? Or no, they just knock each other out as if back to square one. Does that sound like a very important argument, or is that like a just linguistic argument? No, it's a very substantive argument on all levels, as we will soon see. First, let me read it in, and then I'll explore
May
it.
I ask? May I ask?
Yeah.
Does it make a difference if the witness is a eyewitness or an ear witness? I mean, if he heard or if he
no,
sees?
it does not. I mean, again, there's certain there's
How about if
something.
one side has an eyewitness and the
I
other
understand.
side has an ear witness?
It depends on what the category is. In general, it depends what the legal issue is. Meaning you have to have there's something called in the halacha. It's called circumstantial evidence in the halacha is called edus yedia beli re'iyah, which means that he knows what happens even though he didn't see it. Like there's circumstantial evidence. What he saw is enough to figure out what happened, but he didn't actually see it. So in capital crimes, I mean, edini nefashos, we do not accept what we call edus umdana, circumstantial evidence. You have to actually, see what took place. In monetary crimes, there's a debate between, the Rambam and Ramban whether or not we accept edus umdana or not. Now, what you're asking an interesting question. If you don't, there are certain dinei Torah that don't require visualizing. Maybe hearing would be enough. If hearing is enough, then that's the seeing of that particular, case. In other cases, if hearing gives you the full picture, not just a very strong circumstantial, sense of conclusion, but it's actually you'll say, oh, the argument is, I said, I heard you admit that you owe $100, let's say.
Right.
And I don't have to see that. I just have to hear it. But if the hearing is an example where from what I heard, I can figure out the rest, but it's not, but there are two levels here, and it's about circumstantial evidence. So then it would depend on the status of circumstantial evidence. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Right. Well, let me ask you, since it's such a good question, let me bother you.
Okay.
Does in the word aid,
Yeah.
Does the ayin represent the eye and the
No.
dalet represent the ear?
I don't
Does
think so.
anybody bring that down?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you.
This, aid and adim just mean, and these are words I use on Torah, of course. Al pi shnayim adim yakum davar, lo yakum aid echad, the kol chatos
No, what I mean is,
I understand. I
when the slave gets his ear pierced to the dalet,
Yeah.
to the door, after
That's
to
called
be,
ozen, The
yeah, okay.
vinirtza adonav, as
No,
ozno.
as long as it's not brought down with that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's go back to the Nebukayos. I want to read the part. Skip down just to 1 second. Vidas haranbar. You'll see in the beginning of the line it says ranbar. It means Rabbeinu Nisim ben Ruvain. That was the name of the Ran. Look, it's 3, 6, 7 lines down from the beginning of the piece. The Nimukei Yosef, go down 7 lines, and you'll see the word haranbar. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Those who are looking at the Marmakomos, Vidas haranbar zal.
Zeichel uvracha.
Yeah. Delomi boy, he says, the mifter mishuas hatakana, an eidachad misayea is not only, a supportive aid not only exempts an oath, right, a rabbinic oath. He says, Ella afilu mishvua shemechayev eidachad potro mimeno. Even if another single aid creates the obligation, so it's a biblical obligation, even then an eid echad misayea, a supportive eid echad, would exempt. Why? Here's the key lines. Kivan deika eid echad demakhisho, because since we now have a situation where 2 single eidim, each one is contradicting the other, Mashve sahaduse derishon, the second one turns the testimony of the first one kiman delesa, as if it never happened, meaning they knock each other out of the box. It's as if neither one came to court. It's not that, they both came to court, but there's a contradictory, set now there's contradictory, testimony. No, we don't treat it as contradictory testimony. We treat it as if there's no testimony whatsoever because each one knocks out the other.
But we know from the Torah that an aid that gives false witness, and one of them must have given a false witness, is chayav, the monetary knas that would have been.
No, that's in a case. That's in a case of what we call hazama. That's, 2 eidim come to court. They testify that someone owes $100, let's say. Then 2 other witnesses come to court and they say, how could you possibly attest to that transaction? You weren't even in the city, or you weren't in the place when that thing took place. You were with us in a totally different venue. That's called hazama. We'll get back to that. So in the hazama, you're right, there is a rule. The Torah says, v'asisem lo kasher zamam lasos la'achiv. You should do to him what he intended to do to the other. So if he wanted to create he wanted to impose $100 falsely, in other words, he wanted to falsely impose $100 payment on the nidon, and it turns out that he wasn't even capable of testifying about this case because he wasn't there. So we say he has to pay now $100.
Right.
But that's not true for hakasha. Hakasha that's called hazama. So the word zamam means intention, what he intended to do. Vasisam lo, we do to him kasher zamam, as he intended lasos lachiv, to do to his brother. Hakasha is what means contradiction, meaning they're contradicting each other. When it comes to kakasha, it's a deadlock. But what I'm trying to show is there are 2 types of deadlocks, right? This is the question. And there's a question about 2 witnesses against 2 witnesses and 1 witness against 1 witness. I'm going to try to show in a minute that some make the distinction between 1 against 1 and 2 against 2, even though they're parallel. And that is the question is, when you have this kind of balance, or even, but on both sides, So there are two ways legally, there are two ways you can explain it. And Jewish law is complicated on this question, but I'm sure it's a question in other legal systems as well. And that is, you have contradiction, and therefore you throw them both out of court as if neither testimony is accepted. Like, is it on the record anymore? I don't mean the history of the, like on the on official. I'm just trying to exemplify it. On the official court record, do you have both contradictory statements, or do you say, well, they came together, they contradicted each other, neither one's going to be accepted, and therefore, they don't even get it to the, into the court record. Do you understand? So what the Ran is saying is, it's true Eid Echad Messiah cannot be poter Shvua Doraisa, but if the source of the Shvua Doraisa is another Eid Echad, and he comes, and it's what we call bevasachas, meaning within a period of time or whatever, we'll get to that in a second. So then they knock each other out. So de facto, right, there is no basis for the Chiyuv Shvua anymore. It's not really that he exempted it; it's that his action excised or erased, the trigger of this Chiyuv Shua, right? So that's what's happened. So the Gemara, then the Mukhi Yosef quoting the Ran continues, Hani milikish shabo bevasachas. That's assuming they came somewhat at the same time. The Afal Pi Shadanu Bezin Al Pi Edus Shalrishon Kedarina Besota. Eidachad Omer Nitma Patru Melishtos. Eidachad Omer Lo Nitma. Shosa Kivin Dasheni Hikchi Shalrishon. I'm not going to explain this. I'll tell you broadly what it means in just a second. Ein Bedvar Shalrishon Klum. Umitam Da Also Bevasachas Kida Amrinan Chasam Hinami Bazeh Chazeh Kodim Shenasa Maisal Piv Derishon. The Kabasachas Chashiv. Or let's say they didn't come actually together. These two contradictory Eidim, let's say they came, different times, but before the second one came before anything was enacted on the basis of the testimony of the first. That still says, in this matter, this is something I want to get back to, the Ran says that's still considered bevasachas, simultaneous. The simultaneity here doesn't mean, temporally, that they came at the same time. It means that, nothing legally significant happened, post the first one, right, before the second one showed up. So that the question is still
Intimating that Sanhedrin is still in session and hasn't made
yeah,
it.
something like that, or the equivalent of that. It doesn't mean they're in session in the same day, but they haven't taken action yet on the basis of the first evidence. That's still called legabe this question. We'll see in a moment. That's still called bevasachas, and therefore they knock each other out, as opposed to, they're in balance, and there's equal evidence on both sides. We're saying more than that. We're saying they knock each other out, and therefore there's no basis for the shua. Had they been, what the Ran is saying, which is so amazing, is if the rule had been that they're in balance, right, then they wouldn't really be in balance, because the first one creates a chiyuv shua, and the Ran is of the opinion that the second one cannot. If it had been Moda B'Miktsas or Shvuas HaShomrim, he wouldn't be able to exempt, because the Eid Echad doesn't have that power. So it's true it's Eid Echad against Eid Echad, but Eid Echad has the power to create a Shvuah, and he doesn't have the power to negate a Shvuah. So then the rule would have been that you'd have to take the Shvuah. If they were both Ki'isa, if we were still counting them both as being, on the record. But because this expanded simultaneity is in effect, and that's number one assumption. And the second assumption, not at all obvious either, that when there are these two Eid Echads, even if they have different, power, nonetheless, they knock each other out on just on the level of evidence. So then the, the second one doesn't need to exempt the oath. His presence makes the basis of the oath null and void. So then, it's not Eid Echad Messiah Potem and Ashvua, it's Eid Echad Messiah's presence makes the first Eid Echad Kilesa, as if he's not there, and therefore, Mimela, it just, happens that de facto there is no basis for the Shua anymore. So that's a fascinating view of the Ran. And then he explained, if we had, enacted something, gone ahead, acted on the first evidence, then ein b'dvar shel sheni klum, kivin shebo zeh zeh. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. So what I want to discuss, because we're running out of time, is how this ends up again. This is the Ran and then Mukha Yosef on Ar Gemara and Bab Metzia, and this is what he says. But how did it play out? 300 years later, in in the code of Jewish law, in the Shulchan Aruch and the Mefarshim. So now, if you could turn to the new Mar Makomos that we have, I want to read to you. I don't know if I'll get to the Ksos HaChoshen part of it, but I want to read to you parts of a very fascinating Shach. Again, the Shach, was Shaddai Cohen. He was a 17th century authority. He's like the most authoritative, and the next generation, as the Shulchan Aruch was composed, in the 16th century. The Mechaber was Rabbi Yosef Karo, who also wrote the Kesef Mishnah and other things, Beis Yosef. And then you have the glosses of the Ramah in Ashkenaz and Germany, not Germany, really, Poland at that time, but the world of Ashkenaz, Rav Moshe Isserles. This all took place in the 16th century. Then in the 17th century, there started to be, the glosses, the glossing, the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. So the most important commentary in Choshen Mishpat and Yoredeya is the commentary, what's known as the Shach. Shabtai Cohen, his name was Shabtai Cohen. That's where you get the Rosh Tevos, the Shach. And, we've seen some of his last week or so also from the Shach. Whenever you study Choshen Mishpat or Yoredeya, the Shach is the one of the predominant figures. Again, he argued with the Taz. Usually we accept the psakim of the Shach. He was a very powerful figure, and he was a very decisive figure as well. Anyway, so the Shach here, this is, I'll tell you what page it is. Here. I want to read a little bit about it. Again, we're going to have to stop in a few minutes, but I have it on page 4. I'm guessing it's on page 3. Just look for Shach, Choshen Mishpat, Siman Pei Zayin, Sifkot and Tesvav.
Bottom of page 3.
Is it 3? Bottom 3?
Bottom of page 3. Shach,
Okay.
Choshen Mishpat, Siman Pei Zayin.
Yeah, Sifkot and Tetvav.
Yeah.
Because we have some other shocks here. So listen to this. This is like, sometimes you think these are very subtle issues. They are. Like, is there a difference between saying, that there's equal evidence on both sides and therefore it's balanced? That's one way to say it. The other way to say it is, you have a contradiction between witnesses and they're balanced. Therefore, they knock each other out as if neither one came to court. What's the difference? Yes, there are huge differences. These aren't just like, arguments about nomenclature, about, language. So listen to this case. It starts early. I mentioned the Shach, but another important figure in the world of Psak, in call it the history of halacha, as my mentor, Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik would, is the Trumas Hadeshen. So Yisrael Isserlein, he was like a 14th century to 15th century figure after the Rishonim, but before the Shulchan Aruch. Very, very influential in the world of Ashkenaz. So he has this fascinating tshuva. And the Shach begins by quoting the Trumas Hadeshen, and then he's going to disagree with it. What is it? Ha'ikar Kasvara Rishona, okay. Kasab Trumas Hadeshen Siman Shin Lamedalet. Everybody have it? Who's looking in?
Yes.
Okay. So the Trumas Hadeshen has the following case. Eid Echad Mesayeya, Potra Mishvua, he says, in his opinion, a support of Eid Echad, an Echad that sides with with the person who is obligated to take a shvuah exempts him from a shvuah. Okay, that's already an important step, but that's, most of the Chachmei Ashkenaz came to that conclusion based on the Maram Rutenberg and the Or Zarua and the Rush, as we discussed. So that's not new yet, but here comes the spectacular part. Afilu b'moda b'mixas v'shvuas hashomrim v'eid echad makhisho. Even the Eid Echad exempts an oath, even if the oath is a biblical oath, right, of moda b'mixas shvuas hashomrim, etc. Ein sham shehirich berayos. But what he was saying was, let's say, he wasn't saying each one individually. What he was saying was, let's say you have a double or a triple chiyuv shvua doraisa. Okay, let's say you have a motive mixas, right? I mean, I say you owe me $100. The guy says, no, I only owe you 50. Right? So in Torah, you have to pay 50, and you have to take a shvuah on the other 50. Let's say you had an Eid Echad who also comes to court and says he owes the other 50. So you have to take the shvuah because the Eid Echad. So you have to take the shvuah for two reasons now, right? It's motive mixas, and there's an Eid Echad. And if it was also a pikadon and there was also shvuas hashomrim, there might even be three reasons why you'd have to take a shvuah, doraisa, the same shvuah. So let's say you have an Eid Echad Misayeya. On the other hand, the other guy has an Eid Echad who supports him on the other side. Can one Eid Echad Misayeya, let's assume Eid Echad Misayeya, supportive aid, can exempt you from an obligation to take a shvuah. But can he exempt you from a triple obligation or a double obligation to take a shvuah? It's the same shvuah. But there's more than one reason to take it now. But let's take the easier case. It's motive mixas, right? And on the disputed mixas, there's also an Eid Echad. So you only have to take one shvuah, but there are two independent reasons why you have to take a shvuah. And now you have on the other side, all of a sudden, arriving in court is a supportive Eid Echad who says, no, he doesn't owe the 50. So you have two reasons to take the shvuah. And even according to the view that Eid Echad Misayeh could be poter b'shvuah, doraisa, but there's only one exemption. There are two obligations. If we're not talking about different shuas, talking about the same shua. So you have two reasons that obligate you for a shvuah and one reason that exempts you. Are you obligated or exempt?
Still obligated.
So the Trumas Hadeshin says you're exempt. Right? One more time. Right? Kasab Trumas Hadeshin, Eid Echad Misayeya Potra Mishvuah. A single witness who supports you will exempt you from taking an oath. Even if there are three discrete reasons why you are obligated to take this single oath, nonetheless, the Eid Echad Misayeya will exempt you. Ayin Sham Sheherich Barayos. And the Shach says, look what he wrote, and he tries to prove his case. The Chol Devarav Lo Nischavru Etzli. The Shach says, everything that he writes there, I think is wrong. Elanira, it seems to me, de uki chad legabe chad. What you should say is that there are two Eid Echads and they knock each other out. But that means that you still have to take the shvuah because it's also motiv mixas or motiv mixas and shvuas hashomrim. So even if Eid Echad Misayeh is poter min hashvuah, right? But it's only because, or it only knocks out, one chiyuv. If there are three different reasons to take this shvuah, so it's still 3 against 1, or 2 against 1, or certainly if you say like the Ran, which is that it's really Eid Echad Misayeh. Let's say it this way: according to the Ran, Eid Echad Misayeh is not really poter mishvuah at all. It just ends up that way because they knock each other out. Right? But that doesn't affect the motive mixas or the shuas hashomrim. So if the Ran were being consulted about the Trumas Hadeshin's case, right, he would certainly say that Eid Echad Mesayea is not poter from a double chiyuv. But even according to the Shach, isn't initially operating with that. The Shach saying, you know, even if Eid Echad Mesayea is poter mishvua, still it works in the other way too. Namely, you knock out the two Eid Echads, there's still a remaining shvua. Maybe even if it was only shvuas hashomrim and moed b'miktsas against the ptur, the Messiah of Eid Echad. Maybe even in that case, you have two reasons to take the shvua. You have one reason, maybe it can only, it's like a battle, It's it depends how good your defense is, what the nature of the defense is. But the point is divide and, if you say divide and conquer, so you have two forces to impose the shvua, and you only have one defense. So the other, the more, numerous forces, you neutralize the defense, and then there's still one offensive, capability, that gets through. But the Trumas Hadeshin doesn't see it that way. The Trumas Hadeshin is saying, listen, you have an obligation to take a shvua. Fine, you have a ptur. Who cares if there are three different reasons? But what is he assuming? That even when you have Eid Echad Keneged Eid Echad, never mind when you have Chiyuv Shvua versus Ptur Shvua, we don't look at it as Kalesa. We look at it as Keisa. Everything's on the record. And therefore, if it's overwhelmed, it's overwhelmed. And the Shach is disagreeing. So listen, look at the Shach. Elanira, says the Shach, de ukichad legabichad, right? The support Eid Echad, is knocked out by the attack Eid Echad. Saleh Kedusa, Kamandalesa, the Chayiv Shu Daraisa. So knock out the two Eid Echads. Now what's left on the battlefield is Moed B'Miktsas and your Chayiv Daraisa. Either Mishum Shvuas HaShomrim or Moed B'Miktsas or both. So that is a very interesting idea. I'm going to skip a little. If you see the bolden, everybody has the bolden?
Towards the bottom.
The dochek lomar de leinen hesas shiny, va'odaraba ipcha mistabra, the haramban varan v'nemuka Yosef sfiralu de eid mesaya poter mishvuas hatakana, umishvuas hashomer, mamona mixas ain't a poter. Okay, that's not so important. Let's go to the next bold. Va'od nira, the gam b'shtei kite edem makisha zu azu. This is what's important. Amrinan salek edusa de travayu kamandalesa. Right? The Shua Darchiv, Shua Daraisa, below Eduson, Kigon, Shua Sashomer, Mamoda Mixa, so Heses, Hashanami Mishtabeya, Hach, Shavua. So the Shach says, I'm going to go a giant step further. Not only do I disagree with the Trumas Hadeshin, who says that it doesn't matter how many weapons, there are for the Chiyuv Shvua. A single Eid Echad, Misayea, exempts you no matter what, meaning it's Keisa. So the first thing the Shach says, I think that's wrong. They knock each other out. Then he says something further. He says, not just two Eid Echads knock each other out, Kamandalesa, as if they were never there. What if you have two against two? Let's say you have Edom against Edom on two sides of the case. That's called Akasha. But let's say you have the following case. Let's say you have a Chiyuv Moed B'Miktsas. The guy says, you owe me 100, same exact thing. You owe me $100. And the guy says, no, I owe you 30. So Minat Torah, if you stopped right there, what would be the halacha? He'd have to pay the 30 and have to swear about the remaining 70. That's Shuas Moed B'Miktsas, that's Minat Torah. Then all of a sudden, two groups of witnesses come to court. One says he doesn't owe him a thing. And the other says he owes him the other $70. So now, instead of having Eid Echad, Neged Eid Echad, and a Shvuas Moed B'Miktsas, you have Shnayim, Neged Shnayim, and a Moed B'Miktsas. What do you do then?
They knock each other.
Shach says, I don't think there's any difference between Eid Echad, Neged Eid Echad, and Shnayim, Neged Shnayim. right? Legally, in both cases, we say command delesa. We throw them out of court. We throw the ones that are balanced. And by the way, just to make it clear, it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 100 against 2 or 2 against 100, because it's only in Adis is only a kat. Trey's kameya. He doesn't mean 2 against 2. He means Adim against Adim. What he's saying is that Adim against Adim, you throw them out of court. So if there's Modem Miktas before that, or Shvus HaShomer before that, then you're obligated. Right? That's let me continue for a minute. The Heichad in Ischayiv Tchila Shvud Araisa, Mishamirachad Lachud, let's say that you only have an Eid Achad, which imposes the Chiyuv Shvud Araisa. Afil Ba Eida Masaya Achar, Shepaskalo Abezin Shvud Araisa. Let's say the Bezin said, you're in 10 minutes, you're going to have to take a Shvud Araisa. Get ready to hold the Sefer Torah. Okay? Right? And then the other Eid Echad shows up to support him. Yira Mikol Makom, doesn't matter, says the Shach. Eid Messiah Potra. V'chein Kosav Animukei Yosef, that's when he quotes in Animukei Yosef, Shekein Hela Haran, B'chidusha, B'bam Avagav de divrei Haran lo nisbaru etzli b'meshek kasav de kol shelo nasa ma'isa al piv avagav shebo b'zeh achar zeh kebo b'vatachas dami. Shach says, even though I have my doubts about part of the Ran's position, namely his view, right, that the concept of the vasachas, of simultaneity, has nothing to do with time, right, and it has to do with as long as you haven't acted on the first evidence, there's still time to knock out both Adim, because I don't think that is necessarily true. I'm skipping to the bold again. Elakol shabo b'zachar zeh, alpagav shel nasa ma'isal piarishon amrinan rishon havale ketrei, vein dvar shel sheni shu kechad klum keneged shnayim. B'kol mokom nira Rashi v'tosa sham lamayri elahecha sharishon nemon ketrei v'lo kasheni. I'm not going to go into all the details. Okay. So basically, what comes out is 3 very interesting. You have this Ran who says Eid Echad B'Sayeh does not exempt from a Shvua D'Oraisa. But if you have the Shvua D'Oraisa of an Eid Echad on one side and an Eid Echad B'Sayeh is there on the other side, they knock each other out of the box. So even though he's not formally exempting the Shvua, he's ridding you of the source of the Shvua, which is different, but the effect is the same. That's the Ran. Then you have the Trumas Hadeshen, who says, no, that's not true. If you have conflicting Eid Echads, they both remain on the record. And Ad Kedei Kach, however, he says, Eid Echad Nesayea is Poter Mishvua, and therefore, since they remain both on the record, even if there was a second reason for you to be nishba, namely it was motiv mixas and Eid Echad, and all you have on the other side is an Eid Echad who knocks out the Eid Echad. It's an Eid Echad who counters the testimony of the previous Eid Echad and of the implication of the motiv mixas. They're still both on the record to the extent that the Eid Echad Misayea has the ability to exempt even a shvua that is double obligatory. Then you have the Shach, who comes along and says, no, 2 Adim knock each other out no matter what. And if there are 2 reasons to take a Shvuah and only 1 reason to be exempt, you're always going to end up taking, you're always going to end up counting, and you're going to always end up taking the Shvuah. And then the Shach went further and he said, and by the way, in my opinion, this isn't something that is unique to 1 against 1, that when you have one against 1, you throw them both out of court. It's true even if you have 2 against 2 or 2 against 100 or 100 against 2. Meaning even on the Edim level or Edus level, if they are evenly matched, instead of saying they're evenly matched, what we really say is they neutralize each other. And it's as if there's no evidence whatsoever. So you just take them off the board. And once you take them off the board, there's a chiyuv shvua, and there's no exemption. So just I'm going to finish with this because it's late already. The Ksosachoshen were very active on these topics. If you look on the next page, I think this is already what, page 4. It says
Yes.
Ksosachoshen Simin Pezayin Sif Katan Ches. I'm not going to read it because it's too late, but I'll just tell you the Tamsis Advarim for a minute. Everybody see it, and you can look it up on your own. Those of you.
Page 5.
Yeah, I think so. No, is it 5? No.
Bottom of page 4.
Bottom of page 4. The Ksosa Choshen Sim Pezayin Sif Katan Ches. Is that bottom of page 4? Makes sense.
Yes, I got it.
So the Ksosa Choshen says, regarding, again, this is just, so the logic, the logical positions are fascinating, but also it's fascinating is the history, of the argumentation, right? So you have the Ran, then you have the Trumas Hadesh, and then you have the Shach, and then the Ksos weighs in. What does the Ksos say? He says, you know what? I happen to agree, with the Shach. He says about, Eid Echad against Eid Echad knocking each other out. In the end of the piece is what he says. However, when it comes to the idea of 2 against 2 knocking each other out, that I disagree. Meaning, if you have 2 witnesses on one side, 2 witnesses say he's obligated. And then in addition, you have a Shvuas Moda B'Miktzas, which makes him obligated a Shvuah. And then on the other side, you have 2 people who say he's exempt. So whereas the Shach says that he'll take the Shvuah because the 2 against the 2 knock each other out, and all that's left is the Shvuah. The Kso says, I think that's true when it's 1 against 1, but not if it's 2 against 2. If it's 2 against 2, then they remain on the record. And as long as they remain on the record, and on the record there are 2 witnesses that are supportive, you're not going to have a Shvuah Doraisa. What's the difference between, structurally, it's exactly the same. You have a Shvuas Moda B'Miktzas, and then you have either 1 against 1 or 2 against 2. Why would it be that when it's 1 against 1, the Ksos says the Shach is right, and they negate each other? But when it's 2 against 2, he's wrong, and they don't negate each other. And again, this isn't just a hypothetical argument. This is a concrete, basic disagreement in law. Namely, will you be obligated to take the Shvuah? If they neutralize each other, it's as if they were never there, and all you have is Moda B'Miktzas. If they remain on the record, so it's very possible that you have enough on the other side. Right? You have Moda B'Miktzas and Shnai made him on one side, but the Shnai made him on the other side can not only hold the Shnai made him at bay, but maybe their basis to exempt the Chiyuv Shvuah as well. So what's the difference? But I think the answer is very simple. And that is, it goes to what we, first of all, the argument is fascinating. The argument is another argument that tests the relationship on a qualitative level, not on a quantitative level, between Eid Echad and Shnai Meidim. Again, going back to the comment of the Gemara and Shvuah stuff, Mem Amud Aleph, there the Gemara says, Kol Sheshnayim B'chayvin also Mamon Eid Echad B'chayiv Shvuah. Whenever 2 witnesses can trigger a monetary obligation, 1 witness, in the realm of Shvuah, can do the same. So the point is, everything, meaning anything 2 can do, 1 can do, just the 2 can do it for Mammon and 1 can do it for Shvuah. So then if that's the case, from that logic, you would think that if there's an even match, if there's a balance on both sides, so either it's Ke'isa or it's Kalesa, either they both remain on the record or they knock each other out. And that's true for Shnayim and that's true for Echad, because, they're basically both the same. They're Eidos, and the only difference is that one, is more effective than the other, and therefore one works in Mammon and the other one works in Shvuah. But basically they work, pretty much the same way in each realm. Each one is parallel to the other. However, the other logic, the logic in the Xosa's direction, he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't explain it. I'm suggesting, he just tells us the conclusion. I'm the one who's trying to give the explanation of the position. But the idea is very simple. As we said, Trey's Kameya, once you hit 2, it could be 1,000,000 because that's the gold standard. So, but Echad, even if he works b'shvua, even in a parallel way, he's not the gold standard. If another aid were to show up, and then it would be 2 against 1, he'd be out. So my point is, whenever you have trey, it's very appealing to say that it's ki'isa. It's hard to say that they knock each other out. What do you mean they knock each other out? Each one is a maximum. Now, again, the problem is that they can't both be true because that would be a paradox. Either this happened or didn't happen. If there's an obligation or there's an exemption. So, of course, somebody is either mistaken or lying or whatever. But it doesn't matter. The legal category of edus is still a gold standard maximum. And therefore, when we find them, stymied or paralyzed or where they're equally competing in a balanced way, right? You might say that they still both remain, each part of the record still reflects that each one has the gold standard because Trey is Kameh and May is Katrey, and you just can't do better. So you're not going to act on it because they're balanced, but you're not going to reject 2 witnesses unless you can definitively prove, like in Hazama or something else, that they're lying. But when it comes to Eid Echad Keneged Eid Echad, even if on the realm of Shvua it works, somewhat operates like Shnayim Eidim, but even on the realm of Shvua, they're not the gold standard. Right? If Eid Echad is Mechayiv Shvua and then 2 witnesses show up in court, there's nothing to talk about. So maybe that's the reason why here, when there's a conflict, right, we just roll everything back. We say, you know what? There's a conflict. Let's go back, to before the conflict. Let's treat it kilesa. But it ends up being that through this medium of Echad Nisayea, that you are able to test, all sorts of legal issues that underscore this question about this relationship, how 2 witnesses work and how 1 witness work, the relationship between oaths and the Chiyuv Mamon, etc. Okay, we'll stop here. Next time
May I ask Rabbi fast?
I'm sorry?
May I ask very fast something?
Sure.
Yeah, the idea of 2 witnesses, does that come from do they bring this down in the text that it has to do with the Shema, saying the Shema twice a day? Because the two letters in the Shema, the 2 large letters are the ayin and the dalet.
Interesting.
And so that's the gold standard. Doesn't matter if it's 10,000 people.
I hear. It's an interesting connection.
But they don't bring it down. They don't bring it down.
No, not that I'm aware of. But remember, the Torah itself says explicitly al pi shnayim eidim. It does. You don't.
Right.
If this was derived from some sort of a, an exegesis, so then it would be an interesting speculation to say, that maybe this was the source. But it's explicit in the Torah that it says that al pi shnayim eidim yakum davar, that 2 witnesses are. So I'm not aware of anybody who can act, but I think
it's a very big coincidence, Rabbi, that the two large letters are this standard. So the 2 things
may be a coincidence, and maybe it reinforces the idea. It's not the source of it, but it's a very interesting point.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good evening, everybody,
Rabbi.
and we will continue with the topic of motive and mixus. I'll try
Have
to
a
send
nice
in
evening.
Mar Makomos for next time.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Beautiful class. Thank you.
Going to go on to 4A.
Have a good evening and a good week, everyone.
We're going to Dalet Aleph next time.
Say that again.
Which daf are we going to next time?
Gimel Amud Aleph through Dalet Amud Aleph. But I'll try to send in the sources. Yeah, what's called Reb Chia and Moda B'Miktsas. We're going to start speaking about we've been speaking about Shua Seid Echad. We'll speak more about it, but we're primarily going to talk about Moda B'Miktsas the next few weeks. Where a person says you owe me 100, and the other guy says I only owe you part. That whole where does that come from, and how does that work, and like some interesting cases associated with it. Okay,
Yeah,
so
sure.
that's the goal.
Bye. Good night.
The
Thank you.
trajectory, I guess. Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.